Good afternoon and welcome to Actify Chat. I am Matt Cox, and with me today is Mal Hyman, candidate for South Carolina 7th District House of Representatives. He has a master's in international relations and teaches sociology and political science at Coker College in Hartsville, South Carolina. He's previously done human rights work in Latin America and the Middle East and has a book coming out on the role of the media covering the JFK assassination. Professor Hyman, good afternoon. Thank you for sitting down with us today.
Good afternoon. Great to join you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up, and how did that influence your political outlook?
Well, I came of age in Los Angeles, 1968, transitioned from high school to UCLA, and even in high school, I played basketball with guys whose brothers were in gangs and other guys whose parents had been through the Holocaust. And outside, I could see the air I was breathing, and the country was divided. Protests against the war in Vietnam, civil rights movement, riots in almost 100 cities. So it got my attention. And then with the political assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, I guess I became a more serious student. UCLA at the time, it was $300 for a year. State put money into the school, and as I walked onto campus, there was literally 25 or 30 tables of different organizations that were pushing for social change. So that's when I became of age to think about politics and started thinking as a global citizen. And it was kind of forced upon me to make sense of the world. And I had my first arrest during that time, during a demonstration. And when I finished school, I worked for George McGovern and put on conferences subsequent to that on environmental problems up in Northern California. And I took the rest of my money to travel through Europe and the Middle East, and got out of Jerusalem before the war in 73 and decided I'd be a teacher. Taught in the public schools, taught 5 years in a medium security men's prison, Chino Prison, and then did community organizing and drifted into graduate school. Met a fellow that was part of the Pentagon Papers who had worked with Ellsberg and Russo. And he got me back to grad school and ultimately ran his campaign for Congress in 1984. And started teaching at Coker College in 1986. So I've been there ever since.
Well, that's quite a resume. So skipping forward to the modern era, the U.S. faces a lot of problems. What would you say are the top three, and how do we address them as a people? And what would your strategy be as a congressman to fix these problems?
Gee, can I have a semester on that one? Well, we're dealing with transnational corporations that are pledging allegiance to the best investment opportunity at the expense of the earth, workers, the dignity of our people, the health of our people. That's where I would start it. Climate change is arguably the greatest problem facing humanity. And I try to walk people through on that one, tell them about the Pentagon report on climate change being a greater threat to national security than terrorism. That was their quadrennial report in 2003. So it's beyond unconscionable what Trump is doing, but also what oil companies, gas companies, coal companies are doing. These are crimes against humanity. This actually is a theft from the future. We're not borrowing the world from our kids. We're stealing it from them. And we're going to reap what we've sown on this one. We already have the equivalent of plagues with floods, famines, fires, changes of insect vectors. All of this is in the UN report, the EPA report, the Pentagon report. So I try to make that plain. I try to put the spin on it that we can lead the world in sustainability. And certainly outside the government, we're doing that with many cities and states taking the lead and individuals taking the lead in that regard. So that's, I guess, the awesome framework that we start with. The economy is not oriented to create jobs and dignity and health care. We've got the wealthiest 1% putting about 97% of the money into elections. And as Sanders rightly said, it rigs the entire process. Mm-hmm. I suppose in America, healthcare might be the number two problem that can be confronted. And we're facing a $3 trillion health insurance industry that's a protection racket. Canada, with programs of single payer that have been supported by conservative Canadian businessmen for the last 45 years. I mean, the system has worked. And I argue it in a way that I think can resonate with independent voters and moderates and any conservatives that are listening. It's really a conservative issue. The Canadian business people wouldn't give it up because it's good for business. It costs two-thirds as much money, and everybody's covered. And you choose your doctor. It's not an in-network doctor, and you choose your hospital run by the provinces, not by the national government. And not only is everybody covered, they live 3 years longer. It costs two-thirds as much money. It would lower the national debt. So I think that's the second aspect of what we need to do that is something that won't be doable with this administration, but is something where we can be planting the seeds, clarifying the vision, so that we are able to vote people in. We can basically do what common sense would dictate. Now, the British plan goes further and is even more efficient, but I don't think it would resonate and sell as easily with the American public because it's nationally run, even though it costs less than the Canadian plan and has even better results. So I think that's a place that we need to emphasize. And the third is to create an economy that works for Americans, where we're creating more jobs, investing in our infrastructure, sustainable energy, and investing in jobs of the future by investing in our youth with early childhood education and making college affordable. That's where I would start.
Okay. I want to piggyback on your second answer there. You said that it may not resonate with the voters, but we have to, the British system specifically, but we have to sort of plant the seed. So how do we plant that seed? Do we sort of just push people on the idea a little bit, or do we full-throated outright say we need this and push for what Sanders called the whole loaf, and maybe we get half?
I think that there's a political opening that's enormous. People realize the confusion and chaos in Washington, that Trump is essentially the poster boy for the 7 deadly sins, that he's trying to ruin even what was a Republican plan. The CARE Act was Bob Dole's old idea that came from the Heritage Foundation, and they're ruining that after smearing it as being socialism. And so it's a big opening to say what we want to say. The reason I go with the Canadian plan is the way I framed it. It resonates better with the American public, I think, than the British plan. I think Americans want to choose their doctor, and you can talk about the freedom to choose your doctor. And that resonates even with conservatives, the freedom to choose your hospital. And it's run by the provinces in Canada. Here it would be run by the states. So I'm in South Carolina. They probably wouldn't do as good a job as they would do in New York or Massachusetts, but they would be required to give health care to everyone, and they would work it out at the state level. Now, this is good for business, and here's the key part that even Sanders didn't articulate as well as he might have. This is good for business. This is good even for the corporations that I'd like to see run very differently. It's good for them. It lowers their healthcare costs, makes them more competitive, and it's good for small businesses. So I think it's time, without trying to do anything other than argue this is common sense, good. This is going to save you a lot of money, lower the national debt, put money back in people's pockets, and will invigorate the economy. So yes, I do think it's time to push forward using a slightly different set of words and frames on what really is a very old and accepted idea in Canada. Conservatives in Canada wouldn't give it up, and business people wouldn't give up their plan. But most Americans don't know that because it's never in the news like that. I mean, other than a Michael Moore saying these things, Americans don't hear about it. So I think we can try to argue for what Sanders was arguing for, just with slightly different language.
Okay, yeah. I want to repeat something that you said because I think the audio might have fuzzed out a little bit. But you mentioned the common sense for the common good, which is one of your campaign slogans, and I think that that's an incredibly good idea. You know, common sense has been kind of co-opted as a conservative term, whereas common good has been thought of as like a liberal leftist, sort of a socialist idea, working towards a like a solidarity thing rather than a individualist competitive nature. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that again. You ran for this seat a year ago. Can you tell us what you think happened, and why do you think it'll be different this time?
I was the first to raise Sanders platform. So it takes a while to find the people who will work for you and to train them and to have some of those ideas resonate. We were not supported by the National Party or by the state party, and many of the county parties were divided between the Hillary wing and the Bernie wing. And the Bernie wing was not well organized even after the primary in the state. So we had some things to overcome. I say this more by way of observation than complaint. I suppose it's a lamentation and an observation on where things are at. Labor unions were supportive. They had me give the keynote speech, the AFL-CIO in the state, but they're not very strong. The churches, you have to go around to them. They have to meet you in person. They have to hear you. There are a lot of churches, a lot of ministers. And the second time through, people are listening more. They understand I picked myself up off the ground. I'm still running. They talk to me a little bit more. I think they realize what you see is what you get, that I've been on this journey for 50 years. And I believe it. And I feel like silence is betrayal. So whatever I can do, I'm building the lists. I figure that you organize to run and run to organize. So in our wake will be a coalition of community groups that are progressive, that are stronger and working together. And I think people have liked that. It takes a while to raise money if you aren't of wealth or tapping into corporate money. And I'm not taking any corporate or banking money. You can't serve two masters, just as Bernie was doing it. And we're learning how to raise the money nationwide as well as locally. I'd like to have more organizers. I've got a lot of part-time people, and you train part-time people. There is no book on running a congressional campaign on $250,000. Most people figure you can't win at that rate. I think with mastering Facebook and Twitter better, doing work online more effectively, that it becomes more possible than a lot of people think. So like anything, you learn by doing, and we made a number of mistakes the first time through, but we're a lot better with messaging, with outreach, with coalition, with training our own people. I took 3 months off after I lost, got back into it, and I've been through more than 50 churches. We've talked to a lot more of the men's clubs We've hit all the NAACPs. We're going around again on it. Our lists are growing. It just takes a while to build a grassroots movement if that has not been done in the past. I mean, George McGovern did a lot of this in South Dakota and had to essentially work inside and outside of the Democratic Party. We're borrowing some of the ideas from the old Congressman Ron Dellums to pull together community groups that are now meeting. And some of the groups are new, like Action Together, Indivisible, Our Revolution. We've woven them into the campaign, and you can see it in our Facebook and our Twitter. So, it's the joy of doing coalition building. We're better at that. But I also want to mention the establishment wing of the party had nothing to do with this last time. People like Jim Clyburn never returned my phone calls. I mean, here he's a leader in the Black Caucus, a leader in the party, had nothing to do with this. The state party wasn't really rooting for us, so they didn't do much for us. Their major metric is how much money you raise. And if you don't raise a lot of money, they don't care what you're doing on the ground. That's their metric to see if you have a chance to win. I disagree, but I've got to be able to prove that you can win on less money. And we're also a threat to the establishment wing of the party that's always cooperated with transnational corporations. There's a real struggle in our party, and we're fighting them the best we can, and we're gaining traction. We're learning how to do these type of podcasts and shows nationwide. Built up a mailing list of about 60,000 people and growing. So, we've got our work cut out for us, but it's always been a struggle, and it just takes a different form. And I did community organizing when I taught at the state prison. We pulled together a dozen groups in Southern California that worked together and put out newspapers together and ultimately ran candidates. And so we're using some of those strategies and tactics, but it is a challenge.
Yeah, it definitely does take longer to build something from the ground up than to just jump in and run with it. So last year there was a special election in Georgia's 6th district, and the Democrats tried to pump their what they called the Panera Strategy, chasing the moderate middle-class Republicans one quote-unquote Panera district at a time, hoping that they would find Trump to be too coarse and vulgar. Is this the right message? Do you think that there's a way to outreach to Republicans with a progressive message, or do you think that it's better to chase the clean-cut, well-to-do folks?
I think the establishment Democratic strategy is largely mistaken. I think a bold message is what's going to bring out a larger number of voters that will stay loyal to us. But we have to stand for something for them to finally register and to have it resonate with them so that they're going to get out and vote for us. I'm getting good hearing even in South Carolina, even in a district that's 55% Republican. But we have to get out there to tell our story and clarify the message. And I'm absolutely convinced that we are where the majority of the public is at. And if Sanders would have gotten the nomination instead of Clinton, he'd have won by 5 to 10%. And if Sanders would have had more time in South Carolina, he'd have beaten Clinton. But he didn't have the money. He didn't have the connections. Clinton had done this before. She sloshed a lot of money around the state to black churches that ended up supporting her, even though Sanders' economic message is a far better message for progressives and for the public in South Carolina. And that's a whole other story, what happened during the primary. But I do think once we lay out essentially Sanders' message, that people will come to it. We have to say it clearly, and we have to also be able at times to take the edge off it, to speak to independent voters so that they realize that message is a common sense message that helps all of us.
Yeah, it's hard to chastise people for voting against their interests when they don't have an option that is for their interest. So you mentioned another one of your slogans. You cannot serve two masters, which is of course taken from the Bible, referring to money and God. What role does faith play in your political life, and how do you consider it differing from, say, the radical evangelical right?
I think my first visit to the West Bank in 1973, I was horrified at what was happening to Palestinians, and I felt that my faith, Israel, and my country were terribly misguided, and the policies seemed more colonial, and I could see that it just seemed a total betrayal to me. So I see myself as following teachings of the Bible, but I think I'm more spiritual than and I keep the faith in that sense. I do believe in both the Old and New Testament, but I think it's basically a form of liberation theology. It's informed by what I see in the way of society and what you have to do to move towards social justice. I think liberation theologists in Latin America, when I've visited at length with them, I think they have it right. It's a dialogue on social justice with a notion that faith without works is dead, and that we need to pray, read the Bible, read widely in all faiths, look at all cultures, glean notions of liberty and justice for all, and then critically act on them. And then go back to pray, reflect, read, talk, and act. And I think that liberation theology embodies that, and it makes stronger citizens as well as people who follow their faith. And in this journey, I've met people of many different faiths who want a form of liberty and justice for all. And I think my role as a teacher is to try to find a common language and a common commitment so that people can move forward. And we've talked to imams, we've talked to people of many faiths. I've talked to Hindus and gone to some of their festivals. So all of this is part of, to honor freedom is to honor diversity, and to move to some common themes that will make us stronger and more respectful and more loving as a nation. So I guess that's where my spirituality has led me.
Okay, cool. Let's talk for a moment about the Me Too movement. So what is your overall sense of how this movement is proceeding, and how does progressivism intersect with feminism in the conversation about sexual harassment?
It's critical. It's part of the larger debate on dignity and the larger debate on violence in America. And I'm really pleased that people are speaking out. That's the only way we're going to get more traction on these issues. And let me digress with an example. In teaching evening classes at the college that I'm at, I've got a social problems class. One of the lectures is domestic violence. And in talking through 30 years ago to students in the evening, mainly working class, have families, they're working, they're going to class in the evening. I could hear a pin drop the first time I talked. I thought, this is not my best lecture yet, and my gosh, they're very attentive. And I asked, how many have had family members or friends that have been victims of domestic violence? Please raise your hand. And 3/4 of them raised their hand. Well, 30 years later, are still raising their hand. We've not dealt with this. I think it needs to be called domestic terrorism. And after the first time giving the lecture, I realized I'm the wrong person to give this lecture. We need to have a counselor from somebody who's one of the people on a rape crisis line, they need to be giving the talk because people need counseling afterward. And I think until the debate got changed, we weren't making much progress, at least where I was. So I think this is critical for dignity, for people to have more opportunity in the country. It is part of our tolerance of violence in America that gets played out with gun violence. South Carolina leads the country in domestic violence murders. So, I mean, among many things, this is part of our campaign, but also we're starting to bring some of those groups together with other progressive organizations, because I think we are stronger together, and the art of reform is the art of coalition.
So earlier, right after the election, I spoke to a Democratic state representative. He told me that there was some talk among progressive Democrats about the party abandoning focus on identity politics, specifically with the LGBTQIA community. What are your thoughts on the intersection of race and as well as gender and sexual orientation in the progressive movement? Can we separate them from economic justice issues?
I think it's all part of dignity, and it's all part of liberty and justice for all. You know, I try to underscore to honor freedom is to honor diversity. And my next line is to honor freedom is to honor dignity, and honor freedom is to honor Mother Earth. I try to bring it back to that. I think the struggles overlap quite a bit, and we have to learn to work together better, because our separate struggles aren't getting us where we need to go fast enough. We've got a lot of leaders in the campaign that I'm putting together. I've got people that are leaders in the gay rights movement, Me Too movement, Indivisible, Our Revolution. And I think as we continue to talk, we find different ways to help each other out and help a movement out, both outside of politics and inside of politics. I think it's an inside-outside strategy that had been, has been used on and off in the country, but I think that's the way to build. We have to hear each other's stories and understand each other and love each other to be able to fight for each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that's the core of what solidarity really means. It's not about what can you do for me. It's about what can we do for each other. Your pain is my pain. What you do to the least of these, you do to me. So, to bring us back to the Bible again. So yeah, as everybody remembers, the garbage fire that was 2016 brought us Trump, but it also brought us Bernie Sanders, Our Revolution, increased support for the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, the Women's March, and a slew of other left-wing and progressive victories. Was the election ultimately a good thing? Do you think this is what was needed to shake the left out of its complacency?
Well, it certainly is created a crisis stage for the planet, for other countries, and for us. In some ways, I think people were sleepwalking in the 2016 election. Were not very practical or wise. Mm-hmm. I tried to tell the Democratic Party that I saw Trump as not only a poster boy for the 7 deadly sins, but he reminded me of cons that I taught in the prison. And people kind of listened, but I didn't see a sense of urgency. I was not a Hillary fan, but I could see the difference between Hillary and Trump. And this guy struck me as all the tendencies of a tyrant. And in many ways, the country is fortunate that he's not smarter and more shrewd because we voted away an awful lot of power to him. Mm-hmm. There is a reaction against him that is going to steadily build. And oftentimes in crisis, there is, as the old Chinese, calligraphy, danger and opportunity. And there is opportunity here. And there is also a chance for us to clarify some messages as to where we need to proceed, but at a horrible price. And we haven't seen the last of it, because even if Trump gets impeached, we're going to be stuck with Pence. So you're right. It has galvanized a lot of dissent, some of which has been harnessed by the left wing of the Democratic Party, but not a lot of it yet. We're still pretty slow moving and not strong enough to stand up to what's going on in Washington. Although I do see more organizing now than I saw 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the kids going through college today are going to see a lot more activism than I saw, even though, I was a freshman when 9/11 happened and the anti-war movement was kicking off and everything. But now everybody's a lot more connected. The dual nature of social media has allowed us to share our experiences in that exact feeling of solidarity that we were talking about.